Welcome to the Politics and Media programme. Over the last 2 decades, academic research and media interest in the Muslim community in the UK has exploded. This is in part a response to the negative attention that resulted from the 9/11 attack on the Twin Towers and other instances of terrorism. But it also reflects the fact that the Muslim community is the fastest growing community in the UK. In July, the Runnymede Foundation published the new Muslim's Perspective, which highlights the varying strands of the Muslim community beneath the umbrella of one religion. The report finds that the word Muslim is often a code word for negative images of the community. With the Muslim community in many ways more integrated than it's ever been in British society, what are the challenges currently facing Muslims in Britain? Let's take a look at the Muslim perspective as advertised in this Runnymede Trust film highlighting the issues from their own report.
Muslims at present are exceptionalized in a number of ways. They're made to account for their presence. They're made to explain their identity, their faith, to account for themselves in relation to what are dominant values in society.
Runnymede has a long interest in looking at Muslims living in Britain. We wrote a report called Islamophobia in 1997, very far ahead of the curve at the time.
Tonight's event is to try and focus on different aspects of how the issue of Muslims has come to occupy such a position of significance.
Don't do that nasty slip up, because I'll smack you in the face.
We can't just leave the space to those who we know are going to talk badly about it. We feel that Runnymede actually has an obligation to say something positive in this space.
People say, why don't you stop talking about racism? It won't go away. And if we stop talking about the Muslim question, Muslims will not suffer any less on account of that.
There's been a presence of Muslims for many, many years now in Britain, not just historically, but in terms of recent migrations. The issue of Muslimness doesn't seem to be translated particularly well in media representations.
You can be everything else and Muslim, but you will be remembered for being Muslim. You know, if people feel they're Muslim first, then that's an entirely legitimate identity category to mobilise around and ensure is recognised. But that doesn't mean I cease to be a Yorkshireman living in Scotland, you know, a long-suffering Liverpool supporter and all the rest of it.
If we want people to live in dignity, in peace, and in a way in which they feel they have a stake in society, then that involves recognising them to some extent on their terms. I think it's very hard for Muslims today not to fall under some kind of a spotlight. It's alleged that Muslims are seeking things which are unreasonable, haven't been sought before, are problematic, when in fact, when we break down what Muslims are seeking, it may not be the same, but it's relatively conventional.
It does, of course, impact on the way that people live. It impacts on the way that people see people that get on the bus wearing a hijab or, you know, with a beard.
From a government perspective, not just this government, the previous government as well, has tended to, from a policy frame, see Muslims in terms of a so-called prevent agenda, which really is about security and terrorism. It really does focus on other countries, on Pakistan and Afghanistan, on Iraq and on Saudi Arabia, and it turns our attention away from what's going on here in the UK. And to the extent that there is a concern about Muslims in the UK, it's how un-British they are.
Muslim communities statistically feel that they are very British. There is a difference, though, I think, between what Muslims themselves think and what people think that Muslims think.
There's a whole generation of young women who are having their sartorial choices questioned in ways which would seem unreasonable for other religious groups. The headscarf is now something which everybody can have an opinion on.
One of the things I've done is to almost go out of my way to avoid engaging directly with hijab questions. The hijab seems to crop up time and time again when we're talking about the Muslim question in whatever context, even when women aren't being discussed. In terms of Muslim women's identities, we can't win. We're always being confronted with this assumption that we're living under some sort of false consciousness if we claim that we feel empowered through our faith.
People are Muslim and British at the same time, and that shouldn't be confusing to people. There's no problem for them in affirming both a Muslim and a British identity. I think the problem is rather with those who think that there's a problem. In general, I think we're positive about where Muslims are going. There is a growing middle class. As we saw with Mo Farah at the Olympics, they can be seen as very sort of symbolic representatives of Britishness.
We get second, third, fourth generations of these communities coming through who are very articulate, very positive, and are contributing to British society in a whole range of different ways.
It's hard, though, not to sort of focus on some of the negatives sometimes, but we hope the way that we're addressing, and indeed the way that the researchers are addressing the Muslim question, is one that frames the answer in a more open-ended and positive way.
Well, joining us to discuss these issues are Ajmal Hussein, who's a Research Associate at Aston University in Birmingham, by Abdoolkarim Vakil, who's at King's College and also the Chair of Research for the MCB, by Ibrahim Ali, spokesperson for the Federation of Student Islamic Societies, and by Imran Khan from the Conservative Muslim Forum. Welcome to the programme, all of you. Ajmal, first of all, do you think that multiculturalism has failed, or that it's never been tried, which is kind of perhaps one conclusion you could draw from the report?
Well, one of the things the report is trying to do is actually shifting the way that we talk about Muslims. And more recently, we know that Muslims have been implicated in the whole debate about multiculturalism and whether it's failed or what multiculturalism is. And for many Muslims, what is the space for Muslims within multicultural discourse? So partly through shifting this whole discourse or the terms of the debate, the report and the affiliation with the Runnymede Trust, what it's trying to do is to kind of set parameters, set new ways for thinking about Muslims, which incorporates multiculturalism and earlier ways of talking about minorities and others who've been maligned, Black and Asian people, for example, and Jewish groups, etc. So it's not just a straightforward discussion about multiculturalism, and actually by continuing the discourse about multiculturalism and Muslims side by side, we're actually giving credence to the whole debate as it currently stands about multiculturalism. So more so what the report does, and what my work and the work of others represented in that report does, is actually introduce new language and new information about the way Muslims live their lives and how they integrate and interact with broader society and the discourses in broader society about what it means to be British and Muslim in contemporary Britain, whether it's multicultural or not.
Is that how you see it? The report's trying to sort of get past the existing parameters of the debate?
Yeah, it's interesting that the Runnymede Perspectives is called New Muslims, which was the name of the workshop that was held that day. It was called New Muslims for two reasons, as Claire Alexander explained. So, on the one hand, to show that the facts on the ground have changed, the empirical situation of Muslims have changed. And on the other hand, that our ways of thinking and approaching Muslims have shifted. And so it's important to say what hasn't been talked about, which kinds of spaces haven't been looked at, what kind of languages haven't been used, and what, on the other hand, have been the dominant perspectives that have been placed on Muslims. So shifting away from the kind of tabloid focus, the kind of government focus, the kind of policy focus on the lens of securitarianism, on integration and so on, and to instead look at the wide variety and richness of Muslim life, without, at the same time, very blandly reducing it to the notion that Muslims are just like everyone else and everybody is just one universal kind of flattened thing. There are differences. Some differences matter, some not, and the question is which differences are politicized in particular ways. There's one second thing that I think the report does very importantly, is to bring back the discussion on the questions of race and racism. Because when Muslims came on the scene, the notion was, oh, now we're going to talk about faith, now we're going to talk about religion. And race was something that we discussed when we were talking about African-Caribbean communities and so on. No, we need to think about the ways in which the racialization of Muslims is taking place within the sequence and the continuation, although also transformation, so continuity and change, in the way that racism plays out in this country. So there was the workshop, which was the New Muslims, and then there was a panel discussion at the end. So the workshop was reports on current research being done by a lot of very young researchers, including Ajmal here. And the panel discussion was 4 takes on the Muslim question. So what would be this Muslim question? What do we mean by it? Does it have echoes of the Jewish question? Does it have echoes of the color question, of the woman question, and so on, of the nationalities question? How do they play into each other, and what does it mean if we bring that frame into the discussion and say, okay, Muslims are often being problematized. The Muslim question is just a code word for the Muslim problem. But if instead we look at the ways in which previous and other groups and elsewhere have been problematized, are the terms the same? Are the forms of problematization the same?
Okay, Ibrahim, let me bring you on one point that Abdoolkarim made there, because I think it's an important one, because the political right attempted to move into a kind of racial categorization, but denying that it was one, by saying it was just a question of religion and that they didn't have a problem, it didn't have a racial problem here. But that's been a contested area, especially, for a long time, but especially since the war on terror kicked in. How do you read that intersection now?
I think with regards to the way that those two play into each other, I think it's quite clever how they've actually used that as an excuse, as a scapegoat. And I think one of the issues that that we've seen, we're quite interested in from the report, is how young people play a big role in this in particular. But just come back to your question very briefly, was that I think that it's quite healthy that we looked at a wide range of areas with daily life, and women in particular, education, employment, and all facets of Muslim life in particular, and how Muslims are affected in each and every category. But with regards to how the far right have exploited this, I think it's quite healthy how Iran have actually brought Muslims back onto try to bring the Muslim question, as you'd call it, back into the same line as Afro-Caribbean community have suffered in the past, in particular with discrimination with the Jewish community in the past, and say these things have trends that we need to sort of take out and see where we can learn lessons from. I think that's quite healthy. But to sort of pigeonhole Muslims into a completely different angle and say, well, there's an issue of Islam and faith, I think that's really unhelpful. And I think there are practical points we can learn from this, especially of how the far right have actually exploited, that there's a lot of progression in terms of how the black community have been accepted, you could say, publicly, in public life, how the Jewish community have been accepted in public life. And I think the far right and others are aware that the Muslim community is one of the last few communities that, for some reason, that the public life feels that there is it's legitimate to ask questions and to say, why is it that they can ask questions like the report saw on issues regarding the hijab, issues regarding how females work within public life and in private life, and other issues along those lines.
Imran, do you think that the kind of drive of the report, which seems to be to say, look, there are these ways in which the press and government institutions tend to portray the Muslim community, but actually it's much more complex than that. Here's what it actually looks like, or some ways in which it actually looks which are different to this. Do you think that that can win? It's a power struggle, isn't it? The people who are saying one thing have got the facilities of the state and the media at their disposal. The other side of that argument, not so much.
Well, I think the whole issue of multiculturalism and as you posed it, the multicultural question is a deeply polarised debate, which is going to be really quite difficult to win for Muslim communities if it's framed in this multiculturalism narrative, because unfortunately the term has been hijacked by the far right, just as EDL and neo-fascist parties hijacked the Union flag. Similarly, they've hijacked the word multiculturalism to refer to a perceived sense that Muslim communities don't want to be a part of mainstream Britain. The work that the Runnymede Trust has done is an extremely important one, because it shows the many opportunities that Muslim communities can engage in our public and civic life, and it's got a number of excellent recommendations. But I think the key issue is unfortunately going to remain that there's an academic conception of the term multiculturalism, and that's a very different term from what's used in the populist narrative in press like the Daily Mail, who are constantly referring to it as a bad thing.
What do you think about this? Because it's an argument which I think many people will welcome. Do you think it's a winnable argument in the sense that that the opponents of this idea have considerably more resources of political power inside the system than are proponents of this point of view? Ibrahim and Imran were talking about the far right, but if it were just the far right, frankly, we'd have less of a problem. It's very large chunks of the mainstream political establishment.
Yeah, I think that is an important point, and it's important to remember that these discourses around multiculturalism and the survival of multiculturalism have been pushed from parts of the left, and including people who consider themselves as the progressive left, where people are joining in and questioning what does it mean to be a multicultural liberal society, etc. Muslims increasingly find themselves or are placed outside of that narrative, and like you say, a focus on the sort of everyday lived multiculturalism, which is actually the day-to-day reality of life in our streets and towns, points to a whole different reality. And the report gives a lot of exposure to instances where Muslim life actually is problematized and pathologized. So, for example, Muslims in associations with flash cars in inner city Bradford or Birmingham is seen and presented in a different light. You know, Muslims' use of media technologies, you know, whether it's seen as being problematic or a sort of liberatory tool, Muslims show that their engagement with these everyday instruments is actually a transformative encounter, as well as and with politics increasingly, where Muslims are finding themselves having to engage with alternative spaces in which they can articulate a sense of citizenship, a sense of progressive faithhood as well. And one other point is that, and as Abdoolkarim alluded to, that Muslims have a longer history in this country, you know, as workers, you know, in the 60s and 70s, and as Asian youth, and even as black youth, which is something which carries with us. And a lot of our conditions are a result of those socioeconomic factors, you know, which put us here as well. So it's important to abstract Muslims from the current sensational framing that we're in, and realise that actually we have a longer history and belonging here, which means that, you know, who we are today still kind of carries traces of our earlier solidarity with other groups. As workers or through political struggles as well. And that seems to be something which we kind of forget when we're carving out certain spaces only for Muslims, and then indirectly playing into that sort of othering of ourselves as well.
Could I suggest that perhaps the focus on multiculturalism is not directly pertinent to this? The video is called Muslim Multicultures, but it speaks to something which may be important to keep in mind. I don't think many people question lived multicultural condition. In other words, that there are pluralities of cultures around. The multiculturalism bit with the ism at the end comes in two forms. The notion that there is a policy that tries to engender and manage the condition of multiculturality that is a fact on the ground. And secondly, the notion, and this is a specifically contentious one, that it recognizes groups as opposed to individuals. So one thing is okay, is for each individual within a society to have their difference, but what is problematic is when you have groups, and the moment you have groups, you have structures, hierarchies, and then it homogenizes us. There's actually nothing that is specifically determined by the use of the term that suggests that this has to be the case. We are all comfortable with the notion that we have multiple identities and that they're contextual and so on. The same goes for group identities. Unlike Imran, I don't think that we've got to throw out the concept of multiculturalism at all. I think that everything that's worth fighting for, you fight for. But what I think is important is that there is a convergence, and it's very important. There is a convergence on the one hand of the fact that it's not, as you said, just a far-right discourse that matters. It's something that has been mainstream. That's important. But secondly, and I absolutely agree with you, that there is a left suspicion and problem with the notion of faith. But the answer here is not to say take faith seriously only, although it is, because faith-based activism has been part of the tradition of radicalism in this country for centuries. It's also to say, why is it that you foreclose immediately to the notion that when we're talking about Muslims, we're talking about faith or religion or theology? We're not. We're talking about a racialized group. We're talking about the group that is struggling for justice the same way as other groups have. And when we're talking about Muslim struggles for justice, we're not talking necessarily and only about faith or religion. We're talking about broad solidarities that should be built across all groups that need to advance not only the condition of Muslims in this country, but the enrichment that can come from it.
Do you think, Ibrahim, this is an argument that perhaps that we're missing? I mean, that Abdoolkarim suggested that freedom of speech entered in to British political life in the 17th century as freedom to dissent in religion. Do you think that we're missing an argument? Because that's a very hard argument for the right, and especially the mainstream, to deal with, that we're not talking about we're not talking about belief or not belief, we're talking about freedom of speech.
I mean, I agree. I mean, I think it's a forgotten argument. I mean, if you look, like Abdoolkarim alluded to, I mean, there are many groups. The Quaker movement was very influential in this country in the past. You have you have many other groups who've actually used faith-based activism as a means of expressing their individuality and their values and their ethics. But I think, with regards to how it's portrayed out now, I mean, of course, there are elements on the far right who do have an issue with Muslims and certain elements of freedom of speech and expression. And I think it's always a fine line. Where do you draw the line? How do you curtail freedom of speech? And from our stance as an organisation, we've always said that legality is the key. It has to be. We can't. I mean, people will get offended. That will naturally happen. But I think if we agree upon law as a principle, then freedom of speech is a healthy thing. I think it's part of this country's heritage. And with regards to, I mean, the other points that Ajmal mentioned as well, there is an element from the left who actually used Muslims as a scapegoat of questioning Islam and saying, well, should there be any room for faith in the public space? And also the liberal left, if you like to call them that. And I think it's quite concerning that you do see that sort of stratosphere as being stranded out from the mainstream, and it's become normalised. It's just the norm to question Muslims and Islam whenever they do something and someone does something, whether it be a good act or a charitable act. The assumption is that there is some sort of sinister motivation behind it. Whereas, like we said, there are individuals, there are different faith groups within Islam. There's a great history of seamen from the Yemeni Somali communities who have been here for centuries, and you've had the Asian community who moved in post-war as well. So I think the Running Me report has a lot of good things to say, but I think the question really is, where do we go here from now? I think maybe Imran can add on to this.
Do you think one of the erosions of freedom of speech in this area is, when the media is referring to hate preachers and so forth, they're assuming, in a way that they wouldn't perhaps with any other community, that there's a direct relationship between saying something and doing something. I mean, you can't. If I say in anger, even if I mean it at the time, I could kill you in an argument.
Right.
That isn't. I can't be hauled off to court and prosecuted for actual murder or attempted murder. Whereas in the dialogue of terrorism, saying something like this is an act of terror itself.
But I think the issue really here is the credibility that is given to marginal groups like MPAC or very specialist interest groups like FOSIS, and then and in some way trying to kind of meld this into a broader perception of Muslims in wider society. When people talk about anti-racist struggles and anti-Islamic problems, then there's always a tendency by the left to try and refer to workers' rights and broad solidarities amongst the Muslim nation within Britain. But the reality is that Muslims in Britain are extremely diverse people. We are not all members of the Labour Party. We are not all have a certain perception of the Islamic faith. We contribute to society in many ways, in many diverse ways. We are successful business owners. We are successful doctors, and we have successes in even in the faith schools. The people who go through faith schools, is well known that some of the results there have been good, and this has all been achieved by the entrepreneurial spirit of local Muslim groups on the ground. So I think it's really important to not categorise Muslims as being part of some broader anti-racist or struggle which we are kind of rallying against. But and I think one thing that the report does recognise.
I'm going to have to bring you to a close there, I'm afraid, because that's about all we've got time for the first part of the programme. But we will be revisiting this issue in the second half and looking at what it means on the streets, what it means in terms of government legislation in the last 10 years or so to be a Muslim in Britain in the 21st century. Come back after the break.